Eleanor Whitmore stood in the shadowed library, hands trembling as she clutched the leather portfolio she was never meant to find. Inside, bank transfers, legal documents, letters written in Adrian Blackthorne's precise hand, all proving the heartless Duke had been saving her family from ruin while she'd spent months despising him. The man she'd publicly humiliated just hours ago at Lady Pemberton's ball, calling him cold and calculating to his face, had been their silent protector all along. Her pride had blinded her completely. Stay with me until the end of this story. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far this tale travels. The morning Eleanor Whitmore decided she hated Duke Adrian Blackthorne, London was drowning in unseasonable rain. She stood at the window of her family's townhouse on Grosvenor Square, watching water stream down the glass in ugly rivulets, distorting the world outside into something unrecognizable. Fitting, really. In the 3 weeks since her father's death, everything familiar had twisted into shape she no longer understood. Eleanor, you're not even listening. She turned from the window to find her younger sister Beatrice perched on the settee, arms crossed, lower lip jutting out in that way that had charmed their father into indulgence, but did absolutely nothing for Eleanor. I'm listening, Eleanor lied. Then what did I just say? Something about Lord Pembroke's garden party. That was 10 minutes ago, Beatrice huffed. I was talking about the Duke of Blackthorne. Everyone says he's returning to London today after 3 years abroad. Caroline Ashworth claims he's even more handsome than before, though she also said his disposition has grown positively glacial, which I think rather defeats the purpose of handsomeness, don't you? Eleanor returned her attention to the rain. I'm sure I don't care either way. Well, you should. Mama thinks he might be a prospect. That got her attention. Eleanor spun around. For you? Don't be ridiculous. For you, obviously. You're the eldest. You're the one who needs to… Beatrice caught herself, but the damage was done. Needs to save the family? Eleanor finished, voice flat. Needs to marry well now that father's gone and left us in such a precarious position? You can say it, Bea. I'm aware of my duty. Beatrice had the grace to look ashamed. At 17, she still possessed that soft prettiness that would serve her well in a few years on the marriage mart. Eleanor, at 23, knew she'd missed the prime bloom of youth that society valued. Not that she'd been a diamond even at 18. Too tall, too sharp-featured, too prone to speaking her mind when silence would have served better. I didn't mean it like that, Beatrice said quietly. Yes, you did, and you're right. Eleanor smoothed her black morning dress, feeling the weight of the fabric like chains. 6 more months of this before she could even think about re-entering society properly. 6 months of half-mourning while the creditors circled and her mother pretended everything was fine. But Duke Blackthorne, even if you were interested, which I can't imagine, is hardly the answer. Why not? He's wealthy beyond measure, titled young enough, and reportedly insufferable. Eleanor moved away from the window, restless energy driving her across the room. Lady Hartwick told Mama he's arrogant to the point of cruelty. Lord Densworth called him calculating and cold. Even his own friends describe him as remote. Lord Densworth is an idiot who lost £3,000 at cards last season, Beatrice pointed out, and Lady Hartwick is bitter because the Duke refused to dance with her daughter. Perhaps the reports are exaggerated, or perhaps where there's smoke, there's fire. Eleanor stopped at the mantelpiece, staring at the miniature portrait of their father displayed there. God, she missed him. For all his faults, and there had been many, as they'd discovered after his death, he'd never made her feel like a commodity to be traded. I won't marry someone heartless just for financial security. Even if the alternative is losing everything? The question hung in the air between them, ugly and unavoidable. Eleanor didn't answer because there was no good answer. The truth was that her father, beloved as he'd been, had been a disaster with money. Investments in schemes that collapsed, loans to friends who never repaid, a lifestyle they couldn't actually afford, maintained through increasingly desperate borrowing. They'd only begun to understand the extent of it after the funeral, when the creditors started appearing like vultures. The townhouse was mortgaged, the country estate was mortgaged. Her mother's jewelry, already sold, though Mother didn't know it yet. Her father had been selling pieces gradually, replacing them with paste copies. Eleanor had discovered that particular horror while going through his papers. They were, in short, nearly ruined. And the only thing standing between them and complete social annihilation was Eleanor's ability to make a brilliant match. No pressure at all. I should go help Mama with correspondence, Beatrice said, rising. She paused at the door. I'm sorry, Ellie. I know this isn't fair. Life rarely is, Eleanor replied, mustering a smile she didn't feel. Go on, I'll be fine. Alone again, Eleanor sank into the chair Beatrice had vacated and let her head fall back against the cushion. The house was too quiet. Even the servants moved through the halls like ghosts now, uncertain of their futures. How long before they couldn't pay wages? How long before the whispers about the Whitmore finances became shouts? She needed to think practically. Make a list. That's what her father had always done when facing a problem, though clearly his lists hadn't been particularly effective. Eligible gentleman of means currently in London, Lord Pembroke, 60 if he was a day, and his breath smelled of onions. Sir Richard Caldwell, possible, though rumors suggested his fortune was tied up in ventures of questionable legality. Viscount Hartley, already courting the Davenport girl. And then, apparently, Duke Adrian Blackthorne, the mysterious duke who'd spent 3 years on the continent doing God knows what, returning to London with a reputation that preceded him like a cold wind. Eleanor closed her eyes and tried to imagine it. Imagine smiling prettily at a man everyone described as arrogant. Imagine making herself agreeable to someone calculating and cold. Imagine spending the rest of her life walking on eggshells around a husband who viewed her as little more than an ornament. She'd rather eat glass. But what choice did she have? The rain had stopped by the time Eleanor ventured out that afternoon, though the streets remained slick and treacherous. Her mother had requested she pick up a parcel from the dressmaker's shop on Bond Street, one of the few vendors who hadn't yet demanded immediate payment, and Eleanor welcomed the excuse to escape the oppressive atmosphere of the house. Their maid, Jenny, accompanied her, trailing a few steps behind as Eleanor navigated around puddles and passing carriages. London smelled like wet stone and horse dung, the usual perfume of the city intensified by the damp. She tried to find it charming and failed. The dressmaker's shop was warm at least, fragrant with fabric and lavender sachets. Madame Dubois greeted her with professional courtesy that didn't quite mask the calculation in her eyes. Even the shopkeepers were doing math now, Eleanor thought, wondering if the Whitmores were good for the debt. Miss Whitmore, how lovely to see you. I have your mother's parcel ready. The alterations came out beautifully, if I do say so myself. I'm sure they're perfect, Madame Dubois. Shall I? The door chimed behind her, and Eleanor glanced back out of habit, then froze. The man who entered was tall, well over 6 feet, with dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that suggested he'd been running his hands through it. His coat was impeccably tailored but rain-spotted, and there was mud on his boots that made Madame Dubois' smile tighten fractionally. But it was his face that caught Eleanor's attention. Strong features, sharp cheekbones, a mouth set in a firm line that suggested smiling was something he'd heard of but never personally attempted. And his eyes, gray, like the London sky, and just as cold. He swept the shop with a single dismissive glance that somehow managed to assess and discard everything in one go, including Eleanor herself. She felt the look like a physical touch, there and gone so quickly she might have imagined it. Madame Dubois, he said, his voice clipped and precise. I believe you have a package for the Duchess of Blackthorne. Eleanor's breath caught. This was him. This was the Duke everyone had been whispering about. Your Grace! Madame Dubois practically fluttered across the shop. Of course, of course. I have it right here. Please, do sit down. May I offer you tea? No. He didn't elaborate, didn't soften the refusal with pleasantries. Just stood there like he owned the world and was mildly disappointed by the quality. Eleanor found herself staring. She couldn't help it. There was something almost mesmerizing about such complete self-assurance, even if it came wrapped in arrogance. As if sensing her attention, the Duke's gaze cut to her. For a moment their eyes met, and Eleanor felt her spine straighten automatically, chin lifting. She refused to be intimidated by some pompous, Miss Whitmore, isn't it? She blinked. He knew who she was. Yes, Your Grace. The formality tasted bitter in her mouth, but breeding held. He nodded once, a bare acknowledgement that conveyed absolutely nothing. No sympathy for her recent loss. No attempt at polite conversation, just that single nod. And then his attention returned to Madame Dubois, as if Eleanor had ceased to exist. The dismissal was so complete, so absolute, that Eleanor felt her face flush with sudden anger. This was the man her mother thought she should pursue. This cold, arrogant statue of a human being who couldn't even manage basic courtesy. "Your package, Miss Whitmore," Madame Dubois said, appearing at her elbow with wrapped parcel. The poor woman was practically sweating, trying to attend to both of them at once. "Thank you," Eleanor managed, taking the bundle. She should leave. The polite thing would be to leave. But something stubborn in her spine kept her rooted to the spot, kept her eyes on the Duke as he accepted his own package with barely a word of thanks. He turned to go, and Eleanor found herself speaking before her brain could catch up to her mouth. "Your Grace." He paused, one hand on the door, and looked back, waiting. Not even curious, just waiting. Eleanor's mind went utterly blank. What had she meant to say? Why had she stopped him? I wanted to offer my congratulations on your return to London. I'm sure society has missed your presence." It was insipid and false, and they both knew it. His expression didn't change, but something shifted in those gray eyes. Amusement? Contempt? She couldn't tell. "How kind," he said, the words perfectly polite and completely devoid of warmth. "Though I suspect society survived my absence with remarkable fortitude. Good day, Miss Whitmore." And then he was gone, the door closing behind him with a definitive click. Eleanor stood frozen, her face burning, aware that Madame Dubois and Jenny were both staring at her. "Well," she said brightly, clutching her package like a shield, "what a thoroughly unpleasant man." Jenny made a small noise that might have been agreement or horror, hard to say which. Madame Dubois had the grace to look away. Eleanor fled. By the time she reached home, Eleanor had worked herself into a fine temper. How dare he? How dare he look at her like she was something insignificant, speak to her like she was barely worth the breath it took? She'd heard the Duke was cold, but she hadn't expected such blatant rudeness. And the worst part, the absolute worst part, was that tiny traitorous corner of her mind that had to admit he was extraordinarily handsome. Which only made it worse. Beautiful people got away with too much already without being actively cruel about it. "Eleanor, is that you?" Her mother's voice floated down from the drawing room. "Come up, dear. We have a visitor." Eleanor's heart sank. Please, not a creditor. She couldn't handle a creditor right now, not with her blood still boiling from the encounter with Blackthorn. But when she entered the drawing room, she found her mother entertaining a woman she didn't recognize, older, elegantly dressed, with kind eyes and a warm smile. "Eleanor, darling, this is the Duchess of Blackthorn. She's come to call." The world tilted slightly. Eleanor's eyes went to the package she still carried, the one the Duke had collected from Madame Dubois, for his mother, who was apparently here, now. "Your Grace," Eleanor managed, dropping into a curtsy that felt rusty from disuse. "What an honor. Please sit." The Duchess gestured to the chair beside her, and Eleanor obeyed numbly. "I wanted to pay my respects regarding your father. I knew him slightly, years ago. He was always very kind to me." Eleanor's throat tightened. "Thank you. That's very kind of you to say. I also wanted to formally welcome you to the neighborhood, as it were. My son has just returned from the continent, and I'm hoping to encourage him back into society. I thought perhaps, if you and your family are receiving again after your mourning period, you might attend a small dinner party I'm planning next month." Eleanor's mother practically vibrated with suppressed excitement. A dinner party at the Blackthorn townhouse, an invitation that would signal to all of London that the Whitmores were still socially viable. "We would be honored," her mother said before Eleanor could respond. "Wouldn't we, Eleanor?" "Of course," Eleanor heard herself say, even as her mind screamed in protest. A dinner party, with the Duke, with his cold eyes and colder demeanor. The Duchess smiled, and Eleanor noticed it didn't quite reach her eyes. There was something tired there, something worn. "Wonderful. I know Adrian can be, somewhat reserved. He's had a difficult few years. I hope you'll all be patient with him as he readjusts to London." Difficult few years. Reserved. These were mother's euphemisms for "my son is an insufferable ass," Eleanor suspected. They made polite conversation for another 20 minutes, the weather, the season, mutual acquaintances, before the Duchess took her leave. The moment the door closed behind her, Eleanor's mother whirled around, face alight. Do you know what this means? An invitation from the Duchess herself. Eleanor, this could be the answer to everything. Mama, the Duke is unmarried, wealthy, titled. If he were to show you any interest at all, he won't. Eleanor thought of those cold gray eyes, that dismissive nod. Trust me, Mama, the Duke has no interest in me whatsoever. Her mother's face fell. But surely if you made an effort— I met him today, at Madame Dubois' shop. Eleanor set down the package with perhaps more force than necessary. He was rude, cold, and arrogant. Everything the rumors said and worse. I wouldn't marry him if he were the last man in England. Eleanor Frances Whitmore, you will not speak that way. Her mother's voice cracked like a whip. Do you think I don't know how dire our situation is? Do you think I haven't noticed the creditors circling? We are drowning, and you are too proud to grab the rope being thrown to us. The words hit like physical blows. Eleanor stared at her mother, seeing for the first time the deep lines around her eyes, the gray threading through her hair, the way her hands shook slightly as she pressed them together. I know, Eleanor said quietly. I know, Mama, but I can't. I won't marry someone who treats people like they're beneath him. I won't spend my life trying to win warmth from someone incapable of giving it. Her mother was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice had softened. Your father loved me. Did you know that? On our wedding day, I barely knew him. I certainly didn't love him, but he was kind and patient, and eventually I learned to love him too. She crossed to Eleanor, taking her hands. I'm not asking you to love the Duke. I'm asking you to save us. Save your sister. Save our future. Can you do that? Eleanor wanted to say no. Wanted to rage against the unfairness of it all. The way women were always the ones expected to sacrifice, to bend, to accommodate. But she looked at her mother's desperate eyes and her sister's hopeful face. Beatrice had crept into the doorway, listening, and felt the weight of responsibility settle over her shoulders like a lead cloak. I'll try, she whispered. At the dinner party, I'll try. Her mother's relief was palpable. That's all I ask. But as Eleanor climbed the stairs to her room that evening, she couldn't shake the memory of the Duke's face in the shop. The way he'd looked through her rather than at her. The complete absence of anything resembling human warmth. She'd told her mother she would try, but how did you win over someone who seemed to have no heart to win? Yats. The weeks leading up to the Duchess's dinner party passed in a strange blur. Eleanor found herself caught between two worlds, the public face she had to maintain and the private reality of their crumbling finances. During the day, she made calls with her mother, attended small gatherings appropriate for someone in half-mourning, and pretended everything was fine. At night, she pored over account books and unpaid bills, trying to make numbers add up when they simply wouldn't. They'd had to let 2 more servants go. Eleanor had been the one to tell them, seeing the fear in their eyes, knowing they had families depending on them. She'd written letters of recommendation with a steady hand while her stomach churned. The butcher had stopped extending credit. The coal merchant wanted payment in advance. Her mother had quietly sold a silver tea service Eleanor hadn't realized was worth anything. They were bleeding out slowly, and no amount of polite conversation or careful appearances could stop it. You look tired, Beatrice said one afternoon, finding Eleanor in their father's study. Her study now, she supposed, though she couldn't bring herself to think of it that way. I'm fine. You're lying. Beatrice perched on the edge of the desk. You're always in here now looking at those horrible books? It's making you miserable. Someone has to look at them. Why you? Why not Mama? Eleanor glanced up at her sister, so young still, so sheltered from the worst of it. Because Mama's already caring enough. She doesn't need to know exactly how bad things are. But you do? Someone does, Eleanor repeated. She closed the ledger she'd been studying, more bad news, always more bad news, and rubbed her eyes. The dinner party is in 3 days. Are you nervous? Should I be? Beatrice tilted her head, considering. Caroline Ashworth says the Duke is terribly handsome, but hasn't smiled once since returning to London. She saw him at the theater last week and said he barely spoke to anyone, just sat in his box looking bored. How encouraging, Eleanor said dryly. She also said half of the mamas in London are throwing their daughters at him, and he's rejected every single one. Not rudely, mind you, just completely indifferently, as if they don't even register as human beings. Eleanor thought of the shop, of that dismissive glance. Yes, that sounds about right. So how are you going to make him notice you? It was the question Eleanor had been avoiding for weeks. How did you make an impression on someone who seemed to find the entire world beneath his notice? I have absolutely no idea, she admitted. Beatrice was quiet for a moment, then said, Maybe you should just be yourself. Myself got me nowhere at our first meeting. Well, maybe that's because you went in with prejudices already formed. You decided he was awful before you even spoke to him. Eleanor opened her mouth to argue, then closed it. Was that true? She'd certainly heard enough negative reports about the Duke before meeting him. Had she been looking for confirmation of those reports rather than forming her own opinion? No, she'd been perfectly fair. He'd been the one who was cold and dismissive, hadn't he? I'll be charming, Eleanor said finally. I'll smile and nod and agree with whatever he says. I'll be the perfect potential duchess. You'll be miserable, Beatrice predicted. Yes, well, Eleanor returned her attention to the ledgers. Misery might be a luxury we can't afford anymore. The night of the dinner party arrived with unseasonable warmth. Eleanor dressed carefully in a deep blue silk, not quite out of mourning, but dark enough to be respectful, and let Jenny arrange her hair in a style that was elegant without being too elaborate. She looked at herself in the mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. When had she started looking so serious, so drawn? You look beautiful, miss, Jenny said softly. I look desperate, Eleanor corrected, but she managed a smile. Thank you, Jenny. That will be all. The Blackthorn townhouse was magnificent, all soaring ceilings and crystal chandeliers that probably cost more than Eleanor's entire annual income. She felt small walking into it, acutely aware of the difference between this kind of wealth and her own family's fading gentility. The Duchess greeted them warmly, introducing them to the other guests, Lord and Lady Pemberton, the Ashworth family, Sir Richard and Lady Caldwell, and a few others Eleanor recognized from various social functions. A small party, perhaps 15 people in all. And standing by the fireplace, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else, was Duke Adrian Blackthorn. He'd cleaned up nicely since their encounter at the shop, Eleanor had to admit. His evening clothes fit him perfectly, emphasizing his broad shoulders and tall frame. His hair was properly styled, though one dark lock still fell across his forehead in a way that made her fingers itch to push it back. She crushed that thought immediately. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment Eleanor forgot to breathe. Then he nodded, that same bare acknowledgement from before, and turned back to his conversation with Lord Pemberton. Right. Of course. Dinner was an exercise in elegant torture. Eleanor found herself seated between Sir Richard, who spent the entire meal discussing his horse-breeding venture in excruciating detail, and young Thomas Ashworth, who was sweet but painfully shy and barely said 3 words. The Duke sat at the head of the table, his mother at the foot, and Eleanor was perfectly positioned to observe him throughout the meal without appearing to stare. He was polite, impeccably so. He responded when spoken to, made appropriate remarks about the food and wine, asked intelligent questions of his dinner partners. But there was something missing, some spark of genuine engagement that would have transformed politeness into actual conversation. He reminded her of a clockwork automaton she'd seen once at a fair, perfectly constructed, functioning exactly as designed, but utterly lifeless. What do you think, Miss Whitmore? Eleanor jerked her attention back to find everyone looking at her expectantly. Heat flooded her face. I'm sorry, I was wool gathering. What was the question? Lady Ashworth smiled kindly. We were discussing the new exhibition at the Royal Academy. Have you had a chance to visit? Not yet, I'm afraid. Mourning restrictions? She trailed off, hating how she sounded, using her father's death as an excuse. Of course, my dear, though I believe the half-mourning period allows for such cultural outings, perhaps you might join our party next week. It was kindly meant, but Eleanor saw the calculation behind it. Lady Ashworth had 3 daughters and no sons. She was already assessing Eleanor as competition or potential ally. That's very generous, Eleanor said, falling back on trained courtesy. I'll have to check with my mother. The Academy is rather overrated this year, the Duke said suddenly. His voice cut through the conversation like a knife. Half the paintings look like they were completed by children given too much sugar. An uncomfortable silence fell. Lady Ashworth's smile froze. Her husband cleared his throat. Well, art is rather subjective, isn't it? Someone ventured. No, the Duke said flatly. Art either demonstrates technical skill or it doesn't. The current fashion for emotional expression over precision is simply laziness disguised as innovation. Eleanor felt something snap inside her. Maybe it was the weeks of stress. Maybe it was the wine. Maybe it was just the sheer arrogance of this man dismissing an entire exhibition he clearly hadn't even seen properly. How strange, she heard herself say, voice sweet as honey. I would have thought emotion was precisely what separated art from mere technical exercise. A perfectly executed painting that conveys nothing is just, well, it's just paint on canvas, isn't it? Every head swiveled toward her. The Duke's gray eyes fixed on her with sudden, complete attention. You disagree with my assessment, Miss Whitmore. I disagree with your premise, Your Grace. Technical skill without emotion is sterile. Would you prefer a world where every painting was perfectly rendered but utterly devoid of feeling? His expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. I would prefer a world where artists mastered their craft before inflicting their feelings on the public. How fortunate, then, that the public is free to choose what they value. Some of us appreciate passion as much as precision. The silence stretched. Eleanor's heart hammered against her ribs. What was she doing? This was supposed to be her chance to charm him, and instead she was arguing with him in front of his mother and all his guests. Then the Duke's mouth curved, not quite a smile, but something close. An interesting perspective. Though I notice you haven't actually seen the exhibition you're defending, and I notice you're dismissing it based on, what? A quick walkthrough? A review in the paper? How can you judge the emotion in something you haven't properly examined? I've seen enough mediocrity to recognize it on sight. Or perhaps you've closed yourself off to the possibility of being moved by something, and so you dismiss it as mediocrity rather than admit you might be capable of feeling. The words were out before Eleanor could stop them, and the moment they hit the air, she wanted to die. Too far. That was way too far. The Duke went very still. Around them, the other guests seemed to be holding their collective breath. I beg your pardon, Eleanor stammered. That was inappropriate. No. He cut her off, his voice quiet, but absolute. Don't apologize for speaking your mind, Miss Whitmore. It's refreshingly honest. He lifted his wine glass in a small salute that somehow felt like mockery. Even if it's completely wrong. The conversation moved on, blessedly, to safer topics. But Eleanor couldn't shake the feeling of the Duke's eyes on her for the rest of the meal, assessing, calculating, trying to figure out what to make of her. She'd spectacularly failed at being charming. Instead, she'd been argumentative and rude, and had probably ensured he'd never look at her as anything but an annoyance. Her mother was going to kill her. After dinner, the ladies withdrew to the drawing room while the men remained for port and cigars. Eleanor's mother cornered her immediately. What were you thinking? She hissed. Arguing with him like that. I know. I'm sorry, I don't know what came over me. You're supposed to be winning him over, not debating him. I know, Eleanor repeated miserably. I'll apologize when the gentlemen join us. But when the men did rejoin them 20 minutes later, the Duke made no move to approach her. He spent his time circulating among the guests with the same polite disinterest he'd shown at dinner, and Eleanor found herself standing by the window, watching him and wondering what it must be like to move through the world so completely armored against it. He likes you, you know. Eleanor spun to find the Duchess beside her, smiling gently. I doubt that very much, Your Grace. I was terribly rude at dinner. You challenged him. No one ever challenges him anymore. The Duchess sighed, following Eleanor's gaze to where her son stood speaking with Lord Pemberton. He wasn't always like this. Cold, I mean. There was a time when Adrian laughed easily, when he cared about things. But the last few years, she trailed off, something sad crossing her face. What happened? Eleanor asked before she could stop herself. The Duchess shook her head. That's his story to tell, if he chooses. But I thought you should know, what you see isn't all there is. He's built walls, yes, but walls can be climbed. Or sometimes, if you're patient enough, doors open. Before Eleanor could respond, the Duchess moved away, leaving her more confused than ever. The evening wound down. Guests began making their departures, and Eleanor found herself swept along with her family toward the entrance hall. She hadn't spoken to the Duke again, and part of her was relieved. She'd made enough of a disaster for one evening. But as they waited for their carriage, she felt a presence at her elbow. She turned to find the Duke standing there, hands clasped behind his back, expression unreadable. "Miss Whitmore, a word, if you would." Her mother and Beatrice suddenly found something fascinating to look at across the hall, giving them the illusion of privacy. "Your Grace," Eleanor managed, throat dry. "I wanted to, that is—" He paused, and for the first time she saw something like uncertainty cross his features. It was there and gone so quickly she almost missed it. "Your points at dinner, about emotion in art, they were not entirely without merit. Was that an apology, or as close as the Duke of Blackthorn came to one?" "Thank you," Eleanor said cautiously, "though I shouldn't have expressed them so forcefully. It was rude of me. It was honest." He looked at her directly, and Eleanor felt the full force of that gray gaze like a physical weight. "I find I prefer honesty to the usual simpering agreement I receive." "I don't simper," Eleanor said before her brain could engage. The corner of his mouth twitched. "No, you don't." He glanced away toward the window where rain had started falling again. "There's a lecture at the Royal Society next week regarding recent astronomical discoveries. I thought, if you and your family were interested, I could arrange attendance." Eleanor's mind went blank. Was he asking to see her again? "That's very kind, Your Grace." "It's not kindness." His voice was flat again, walls back up. "I simply thought you might find it interesting. You seem like someone who appreciates intellectual discourse." It should have been a compliment. Somehow it felt like he was checking a box. Intelligent woman, likes arguing, probably enjoys science lectures. Noted. "I would love to attend," Eleanor heard herself say. "Thank you." He nodded once, that same curt nod, and stepped back. "I'll send details to your mother. Good evening, Miss Whitmore." "Good evening, Your Grace." She watched him walk away ramrod straight, perfectly controlled, and felt the strangest urge to throw something at his head just to see if he'd react. In the carriage ride home, her mother was effusive. "An invitation to the Royal Society. Eleanor, this is wonderful. He's clearly interested." "He's clearly being polite," Eleanor corrected. "He probably invites everyone to boring lectures." "Don't be contrary. This is exactly what we hoped for." But as Eleanor stared out at the rain-soaked streets, she couldn't shake the feeling that she'd just agreed to something far more complicated than a simple lecture. The Duke was a puzzle she didn't understand, all sharp edges and locked doors. And despite her better judgment, she wanted to understand him. Wanted to know what had turned a man who apparently once laughed easily into this cold, controlled stranger. Wanted to find out if the Duchess was right, if there was something more beneath the ice, and that wanting, Eleanor suspected, was going to be far more dangerous than anything else. The lecture at the Royal Society turned out to be exactly as dry as Eleanor had feared and somehow worse than she'd imagined. A wizened professor with a voice like gravel droned on about celestial mechanics while Eleanor fought to keep her eyes open. She'd positioned herself in the third row beside her mother, directly in the Duke's line of sight, and the pressure to appear fascinated was exhausting. Across the aisle, Adrian Blackthorn sat with perfect posture, his face a mask of polite attention. He hadn't looked at her once since they'd arrived. "The precession of the equinoxes," the professor intoned, "demonstrates the gradual shift in the orientation of Earth's axis of rotation." Eleanor's mind wandered. The rent on the townhouse was due in 2 weeks. They didn't have it. She'd spent the last 3 nights running numbers, trying to find money that simply didn't exist. The silver tea service her mother had sold had bought them time, nothing more. She needed this to work. Needed the Duke to be interested, needed him to offer marriage so she could save her family from complete ruin. The thought made her stomach turn. Miss Whitmore seems less than enthralled. Eleanor jerked her head up to find the Duke had somehow materialized beside her during the brief intermission. Her mother had wandered off to speak with Lady Pemberton, leaving Eleanor momentarily alone. "I'm finding it very educational," she lied. "You were falling asleep." "I was resting my eyes." "You were drooling slightly." Eleanor's hand flew to her mouth. "I was not—" She stopped, seeing the faint glimmer of something in his eyes. Amusement? You're teasing me. Merely observing. He settled into the seat her mother had vacated, and Eleanor became acutely aware of how close he was. He smelled like sandalwood and something crisp she couldn't identify. I apologize. The lecture is quite tedious. Then why invite me? Because you struck me as someone who might appreciate learning, even when the delivery is less than inspiring. Was I wrong? Eleanor studied him, trying to read past that carefully neutral expression. You weren't wrong. I do love learning, but this... She gestured at the podium where the professor was setting up glass slides. This feels like punishment disguised as education. An apt description. He was quiet for a moment, then added, There's a better lecture next month. Dr. Elizabeth Blackwell is speaking on medical advances. She's actually engaging. You're already planning the next boring outing before this one is finished? I prefer to think ahead. You prefer to control everything, Eleanor corrected, then immediately regretted it. There she went again, speaking without thinking. But the Duke didn't look offended. If anything, that almost amusement deepened. Yes, he admitted, I do. Is that a problem? Only if you expect everyone around you to be equally controlled. I don't expect anything from anyone, Miss Whitmore. I found it's the only way to avoid disappointment. The words were casual, but something in his tone caught her attention, something bitter beneath the smooth surface. That sounds lonely, she said quietly. His expression shuddered immediately. The lecture is resuming. We should pay attention. He stood, returning to his own seat, and Eleanor felt the dismissal like a door slamming. She'd gotten too close to something real, and he'd retreated behind his walls faster than she could blink. The rest of the lecture passed in a fog. Eleanor tried to focus, tried to care about orbital mechanics and stellar distances, but her mind kept returning to the Duke's face when she'd called him lonely, the way he'd flinched just slightly before locking everything down. What had happened to him? What had turned him into this fortress of a man? Afterward, as they gathered in the society's reception hall for refreshments, Eleanor found herself watching him work the room. He moved through conversations like a chess player executing predetermined moves. Smile here, nod there, appropriate comment, graceful exit. Everything calculated, nothing spontaneous. He's quite something, isn't he? Eleanor turned to find a young woman beside her, maybe a year or two younger, with auburn hair and sharp green eyes. She looked vaguely familiar. I'm sorry, have we met? Catherine Hartwell. My brother is Lord Densworth, the idiot who called the Duke calculating, if you recall. Catherine's smile was wry. He wasn't wrong, mind you. Adrian is calculating, but then most of us would be too if we'd been through what he has. Eleanor's curiosity sparked. What did he go through? Catherine's expression turned sympathetic. You really don't know. I suppose it makes sense. It all happened while he was abroad and the family kept it quiet. She glanced around, then lowered her voice. His younger brother died. Thomas. Barely 20 years old. Riding accident, they said, though there were rumors it was more complicated than that. The world seemed to tilt slightly. A brother. Dead. When? Eleanor managed. 3 years ago, right before Adrian left for the continent. Some people said he fled. Others said he was conducting business. But my brother, for all his faults, was friends with Thomas. He said Adrian blamed himself. Something about an argument they'd had, some falling out. And then Thomas was gone, and Adrian... Catherine shrugged. Well, you see what he became. Eleanor did see. Suddenly, horribly, she saw. The walls, the control, the careful distance from anything resembling emotion. This wasn't arrogance. This was armor. Thank you for telling me, Eleanor said softly. Just thought you should know. Catherine tilted her head toward where the Duke stood, listening to Lord Pemberton with that same polite blankness. Everyone thinks he's cold. Maybe he is, but maybe he just can't afford to be warm anymore. The rest of the evening passed in a strange haze. Eleanor went through the motions, smiling, conversing, accepting the Duke's offer to escort her family home in his carriage. But her mind was spinning, rearranging everything she thought she knew about Adrian Blackthorne. In the carriage, her mother chattered away about the lecture while Beatrice dozed against the window. The Duke sat across from Eleanor, staring out at the darkened streets, his face unreadable. Your Grace, Eleanor ventured, may I ask you something? His eyes shifted to her. Of course. Why did you really invite me today? And please don't say it's because I appreciate intellectual discourse. For a long moment, he didn't answer. Then, you're different from the others. The ones who simper and agree and pretend to be whatever they think I want. You argued with me about art. You fell asleep during a lecture I invited you to. You called me lonely to my face. He paused. It's refreshing. Uncomfortable, but refreshing. I'm sorry about your brother, Eleanor blurted out. The temperature in the carriage dropped 10 degrees. The Duke went absolutely still. Who told you? Does it matter? Yes. Eleanor lifted her chin. Catherine Hartwell. She thought I should know. She had no right. His voice was ice. And you have no right to pity me. I don't pity you. I'm simply... Don't. The single word cut like a blade. Whatever you think you understand about me, Miss Whitmore, you don't. And I would appreciate it if you didn't presume to. The carriage pulled up to the Whitmore townhouse, and Eleanor's mother woke Beatrice with gentle shakes. The Duke didn't move, didn't offer to help them down, just sat frozen in his corner like a statue. Eleanor climbed out, then turned back. For what it's worth, Your Grace, I think your brother would hate what you've become. She slammed the carriage door before he could respond, but not before she saw his face, stark white, eyes wide with something that looked like devastation. Her mother grabbed her arm as the carriage pulled away. Eleanor, what were you thinking? You can't speak to him that way. Why not? Everyone else is too afraid to tell him the truth. The truth about what? That hiding from grief doesn't make it hurt less. It just makes you half alive. Eleanor brushed past her mother and sister, into the house, up to her room. She locked the door and pressed her back against it, breathing hard. What had she done? She just destroyed any chance of securing the Duke's interest. More than that, she'd been cruel. Deliberately cruel, throwing his brother's death in his face like a weapon. But the look on his face when she'd mentioned Thomas, the absolute devastation before the walls slammed down, that was real, that was human, that was the man hiding beneath all that ice. Eleanor changed for bed mechanically, her mind replaying the evening over and over. The Duke's admission that she was different. His immediate retreat when she'd offered sympathy. The way he'd looked when she'd mentioned his brother, like she'd struck him. She should apologize. She should write a letter, grovel, beg his forgiveness. But a stubborn part of her refused. He needed to hear it, needed someone to crack that armor, even if it hurt, even if it cost her everything. She just hoped she hadn't made things irreparably worse. The answer came 3 days later in the form of a letter delivered by the Duke's footman. Eleanor's hands shook as she broke the seal. Miss Whitmore, your words the other evening were inappropriate and presumptuous. They were also not entirely inaccurate. I find I cannot decide whether to thank you or never speak to you again. There is a gallery exhibition opening next week, the same one I so thoroughly dismissed at dinner. I thought you might enjoy attending so you can see firsthand how wrong my assessment was. Yours, Blackthorn. Eleanor read it 3 times, trying to parse the tone. Was this an apology? An olive branch? Or was he calling her bluff, daring her to defend the exhibition she'd championed without having seen it? Probably all 3, knowing him. What does it say? Beatrice demanded, appearing at her elbow. He's invited me to an art exhibition. That's wonderful. Isn't it wonderful, Mama? Their mother looked up from her correspondence, face lined with worry. I suppose. Though Eleanor did insult him rather spectacularly, I'm surprised he's still speaking to her at all. Maybe he likes being insulted, Beatrice suggested. Maybe everyone's always so nice to him that it's boring. Eleanor thought of the Duke's words in the carriage. You're different from the others. Maybe Beatrice was right. Maybe Adrian Blackthorn had spent so long being agreed with, deferred to, treated like some untouchable deity, that honest criticism felt like fresh air. Or maybe she was rationalizing her own terrible behavior. Either way, she had to go, had to see him again, had to prove to herself and to him that she could be civil, that she could navigate this strange dance they'd stumbled into. I'll need a new dress, she said. Her mother's expression turned pained. Eleanor, I know we can't afford it, but if this is going to work, if he's going to consider me seriously, I can't keep wearing the same 3 gowns. People will talk. The silence stretched thin. Finally, her mother nodded. I'll speak to Madame Dubois. Perhaps she'll extend credit one more time. The guilt was immediate and crushing, but Eleanor pushed it down. This was for all of them. For Beatrice's future, for keeping the roof over their heads. She just had to make the Duke fall in love with her. Simple. The gallery exhibition was nothing like Eleanor expected. Instead of the stuffy, formal viewing she'd imagined, the event was crowded and noisy, full of artists and critics and society figures all crammed together arguing about brush strokes and composition. Eleanor wore her new dress, a deep emerald that had cost far too much, and tried not to think about the bill waiting at home. The Duke met her at the entrance, impeccably dressed as always, his expression giving away absolutely nothing. "Miss Whitmore, thank you for coming. Thank you for inviting me. I hope I can prove you wrong about the exhibition's merit." "I hope so too. I'd hate to think I wasted an entire evening being unnecessarily cruel about it." Was that self-awareness? From the Duke of Ice? They moved through the gallery slowly, stopping at each painting. Some were beautiful, some were bizarre. One appeared to be nothing more than random splashes of color, which Eleanor privately thought looked like someone had knocked over several paint pots and called it art. "Well?" the Duke asked, stopping before a particularly abstract piece. "Emotion or technical skill?" Eleanor studied the canvas, harsh slashes of red and black, chaotic and violent. It made her uncomfortable to look at, which she suspected was the point. "Both," she said finally. "The technique is there in the way the colors blend, the way the composition draws your eye. But the emotion is what makes it memorable. It feels angry, desperate." "It feels like a mess," the Duke countered. "Maybe, but a meaningful mess." "There's no such thing. Mess is just chaos pretending to have purpose." Eleanor turned to face him fully. "Is that what you think about grief too? That it's just chaos that should be controlled and tidied away?" His jaw tightened. "I thought we were discussing art." "We are. Art, grief, life. It's all connected, isn't it? The messiness, the chaos, the things we can't control no matter how hard we try." "Some of us prefer order, Miss Whitmore. Some of us hide behind order because feeling things is too frightening." They stared at each other, the conversation around them fading into background noise. Eleanor's heart hammered. She'd done it again, pushed too hard, said too much. But the Duke didn't walk away. Instead, he said quietly, "Come with me." He led her through the crowded gallery to a quieter room in the back, less populated. Here, the paintings were smaller, more intimate. He stopped before one that showed a young man on horseback, laughing, wind in his hair. Eleanor's breath caught. The style was different from the artist's other work, looser, more personal. And the subject, "Your brother," she said softly. The Duke nodded, not looking at her. "Thomas commissioned this the month before he died. The artist was a friend of his. After the accident, she gave it to my mother." His voice was carefully controlled, each word precisely measured. "I hadn't seen it until today." Eleanor looked at this painting, at the joy captured there, and felt her throat tighten. "He looks happy." He was. Always. Even when he had no reason to be. Adrian's hands clenched at his sides. "We argued the day before he died. About something stupid, I can't even remember what. And I was cold to him, dismissed him. The last thing I ever said to my brother was, 'Stop being so childish.'" The words hung in the air between them, heavy with old pain. "That's not your fault," Eleanor said. "Isn't it? If I'd been kinder, if I'd listened, maybe he wouldn't have ridden out that day. Maybe he wouldn't have been so reckless." "You can't know that. You can't carry the weight of every possible outcome." "Then what should I carry, Miss Whitmore? What am I supposed to do with all this?" He stopped, breathing hard, and Eleanor realized she was seeing him truly vulnerable for the first time. The mask had cracked, and beneath it was nothing but raw grief. Without thinking, she reached out and took his hand. He flinched, but didn't pull away. "You're supposed to feel it," she said quietly. "The grief, the guilt, the anger, all of it. You feel it, and you survive it, and eventually it becomes something you can live with instead of something that's killing you." "You sound like you speak from experience." "My father. I was angry at him for so long. For the debts, the lies, the mess he left us in. And then he died, and I couldn't be angry anymore because he was gone. But the anger didn't go away, it just mixed with the grief until I couldn't tell them apart. Adrian looked at her, really looked at her, and something shifted in his expression. How do you manage it? Badly, most days. But I'm trying. That's all we can do, isn't it? Try to survive each day until surviving becomes living again. They stood there in the quiet gallery, hands clasped, looking at the painting of a young man who would never grow old. Around them, the exhibition continued, but here in this small room, it felt like they existed in a bubble outside time. I'm sorry, Adrian said finally, for being so cold, so controlled. It's easier than... I know, Eleanor interrupted gently. I know. He squeezed her hand once, then released it. The mask began to slide back into place, but not completely. Something had changed. Some wall had been breached. We should return to the main gallery, he said. People will talk if we're gone too long. Let them talk. A ghost of a smile crossed his face. Spoken like someone who doesn't have a reputation to maintain. Spoken like someone who's tired of pretending everything is fine when it's not. They made their way back to the crowded rooms, but something was different now. The Duke stood closer to her, his arm occasionally brushing hers as they moved through the crowd. When Lord Pemberton made a pompous comment about one painting's lack of classical training, Adrian caught Eleanor's eye, and she saw humor there, genuine, warm humor. It was like watching ice begin to thaw. The evening ended too quickly. As Adrian escorted Eleanor to her carriage, he said, "Would you walk with me tomorrow? In the park?" "I'd like that." "Bring a chaperone if you must, but I'd prefer just you." Eleanor's eyebrows rose. "Your Grace, that's rather scandalous." "Yes, well, you seem to bring out my scandalous side, Miss Whitmore." She laughed, actually laughed, and saw answering warmth in his eyes. "Tomorrow then, 10 o'clock? I'll count the hours." It should have sounded mocking. Instead, it sounded sincere.